And joining us now to talk war on drugs, from Miami, Florida, Bruce Bagley. He is the chair of the International Studies Department at the University of Miami. And Bruce, we welcome you to TVO tonight. How you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm doing well.
Glad to hear it. We know it was Richard Nixon in 1971 who started the first campaign against drugs, but I guess people really remember that it was President Ronald Reagan in 1982 who started the so-called war on drugs. And since then, I'm wondering whether you think Latin American countries in general have been effective partners in that war.
I would say no, for a variety of reasons. The fact of the matter is that there are more drugs coming out of Latin America. They're cheaper and more readily available than ever before. So despite the efforts of some governments at different points in time, the fact of the matter is that we are losing the war on drugs. And there does not seem to be anything like victory anywhere in the near future.
Of late in particular, the war on drugs seems to be doing rather badly in Mexico. Bring us up to date on that situation there and tell us why you believe it has been so ineffective of late.
Mexico is the latest victim in some senses of the overall problem of drug trafficking from Latin America to the United States. It was Colombia in the 1980s and the 1990s, partial victory in the war on drugs in the Andean region, particularly in Colombia, through what is known as Plan Colombia. $6 billion of United States aid has driven drug trafficking northwards, especially along the Pacific corridor, into Mexico. Mexico is particularly vulnerable. It had 71 years of authoritarian rule. It inherited a set of highly corrupt institutions. The process of democratization itself has made institutions even weaker and less capable of controlling the drug trafficking passing through Mexico into the United States, and by the way, Canada. There are $25 billion a year of profits for these drug organizations in Mexico, and they are fighting among themselves for control over routes and turf and what are called plazas, or crossover points into the United States. They are also battling the Mexican government, which since President Felipe Calderón took office on December 1st, 2006, has increasingly deployed the military. Some 45,000 troops in 8 different states and 10 different cities around the country. This has become a kind of bloodbath in which the profits are extremely high, and the organizations, the drug organizations that are involved, are fighting for their piece of the pie. The Mexican government simply does not have the institutional capacity. Its tradition of corruption, of weak police force, of weak judiciary, and a hellish prison system have combined to make Mexico the epicenter of drug trafficking into the United States as we speak.
Let's read something here that was published in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year, and this is the message, the central message, I guess you could call it, on a report done by the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy. And it's 3 former presidents from the region who authored this report. You know it well. I'm going to read an excerpt for our viewers. The war on drugs, they write, has failed, and it's high time to replace an ineffective strategy with more humane and efficient drug policies. The revision of U.S.-inspired drug policies is urgent in light of the rising levels of violence and corruption associated with narcotics. The alarming power of the drug cartels is leading to a criminalization of politics and a politicization of crime. And the corruption of the judicial and political system is undermining the foundations of democracy in several Latin American countries. Former Presidents Cardoso, Gaviria, and Zedillo having signed that. What changes in particular can you tell us that these former Latin American presidents would really like to see as soon as possible?
I think the first point to make is that all of them come from countries that have suffered massively under this so-called war on drugs, which is in of itself a misnomer. In many senses, their countries and their institutions have been the victims because we've been willing to fight the war on drugs throughout Latin America. We have not done anywhere near as good a job here in the United States. So there are 2 things that they first want. They want a policy that moves away from the kind of rigid prohibitionist approaches that have proven not to work over the last 30 to 40 years of this modern war on drugs. And they want to move to what are called harm reduction policies, where we treat drug use and abuse as a public health problem, where we provide treatment on demand, where we launch prevention and education programs, treatment and rehabilitation programs, community-based policing, rather than looking at this as a war. They start with marijuana, and their argument is that we should move quickly to the decriminalization of marijuana, and that we should study how best to deal with harder drugs such as cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, and others. Because what we have tried has failed. It's led to massive corruption and violence in country after country in Latin America. An entire generation, now the second generation of young people being lost in what is a highly lucrative trade in a region that is surrounded and immersed in poverty and which has very little institutional capacity to fight against it. So they're asking for a shift in strategy, starting with marijuana. And they also think that the United States and other developed countries, Canada, the European Union, should also begin to shift away from what have proven to be not only failed policies, but counterproductive policies that spread damage, that spread violence, towards programs that look at the possibility of reducing through prevention and education, of treating addicts, of establishing youth courts, and other things. They call for much further and deeper study beyond the marijuana issue, but they are adamant about the decriminalization of marijuana as a first start, because they do not want to incarcerate yet another generation of young people in Latin America.
And Bruce, you've studied this for years and years, so tell me, in your view, are they right?
Yes, I think they are, in essence. In fact, I don't think they go far enough in a couple of different ways. But clearly, what we have been doing, actually since 1914, when the United States began to make drugs such as cocaine and heroin illicit, 1937, when we finally banned marijuana altogether, this is moving on to a 100 Years' War. This 100 Years' War in the United States has not worked to the benefit of the American people. It certainly hasn't worked to the benefit of the Latin American people. In this country, we have 2.3 million people in prison, 500,000 in prison for nonviolent drug crimes, or basically for nonviolent drug crimes. We are warehousing an entire generation. That can't be considered success by any measure, and it's costing huge amounts of money.
Tell me this, though. You pointed out earlier that it's been almost 100 years that the United States has, in some form or other, been targeting Latin America in a kind of a war on drugs. Why do you think it's taken as long as it clearly has for people in a position of authority, or I guess former authority is a better way to say it, to come forward with some kind of really hard-hitting alternative to the way it has been for almost a century?
Well, actually, I think there are several different reasons. In previous decades, many Latin American countries were quite authoritarian. So the authoritarian governments, in effect, controlled drug trafficking and benefited from it. They were corrupt, but they contained drug trafficking. As Latin America has moved towards democratization, the old authoritarian controls, and by the way, the complicit relationships between traffickers and authoritarian rulers have broken down. Democratization doesn't bring unmixed benefits all the time. There are very often downsides to the process of democratization. It has brought to the fore the weakness of a number of institutions inherited from the authoritarian past. And now we have a generation of Latin American presidents elected who had to serve and implement the war on drugs, who are now reflecting on their presidencies and arguing that the costs have been way too high for them and for their countries, and that we need an alternative to these kinds of things.
In the spring of 2009, The Economist magazine weighed in on this as well, and they seem to be more on the side of the three leaders and you than they are the other way. They say it plainly. The war on drugs has been a disaster, creating failed states in the developing world, even as addiction has flourished in the rich world. By any sensible measure, they write, this 100-year struggle has been illiberal, murderous, and pointless. That is why The Economist continues to believe that the least bad policy is to legalize drugs. Legalization would not only drive away the gangsters, it would transform drugs from a law and order problem into a public health problem, which is how they ought to be treated. Governments would tax and regulate the drug trade and use the funds raised and the billions saved on law enforcement to educate the public about the risks of drug taking and to treat addiction. What I'm wondering is, do you see, either in your country or across Latin America, an increasing appetite for the legalization of drugs?
Yes, I think we're seeing it around the globe because these conclusions are not unique to the three Latin American presidents we've mentioned. The Economist has been advocating this position, but their voices are being heard much more clearly throughout Europe. And we are also seeing movement in the United States. If we start with Europe, in 2001, Portugal actually decriminalized all drug trafficking, and they have been quite successful. There are fewer people who take drugs now that they have been decriminalized in Portugal, and twice as many people who have voluntarily sought treatment in Portugal. So without any of the drug-related violence, Portugal is in some senses an alternative path, an alternative route. In Latin America, we saw Mexico and President Calderon sign into law a partial decriminalization of personal doses. They're very small. 4 marijuana cigarettes, 0.5 grams of cocaine or heroin. But it is a start. And the Mexicans have been driven to this because they are warehousing huge numbers of their young people. They're losing an entire generation, many of whom have been caught up in drug abuse, others who've been caught up in drug trafficking as well as drug abuse, and they put hundreds of thousands of teenagers and young adults in jails. They can't afford it. Their jails are hellholes where young people learn to be hardened criminals. It's a kind of graduate school for organized crime. So the Mexicans have done this. We've also seen the Argentine Supreme Court say that personal doses are part of the freedoms guaranteed by their own constitution. Colombia, a few years ago, adopted a similar policy, so there are 3 in Latin America that have begun to decriminalize personal doses. None of them advocate drug consumption. It's certainly not openly available. They are simply trying to alter the trajectory.
Bruce, let me raise this in our last minute here. I have a couple of numbers that I want to share with you and our viewers on following up on a couple of things you just raised, the recession and the prison population, rather. And here we go. First graphic, please. The prison population rates in some of the larger countries around the world, we see the United States way at the top of the charts, Russia a little less, South Africa half of the American number, and China and Canada much lower. And then if you go towards the next graphic, which is the cost of correctional services, American states, which as you point out bear the burden of this, have seen their corrections costs rise more than 300% over the 20-year period that we've got on the graph right there. My last question in our last minute is, do you think, given the financial pressures that are on everybody these days and the level of incarceration that you seem to be doing in your country, that it presents itself as an opening to change policy on this front?
Yes, I absolutely do. And President Obama and his Attorney General, Eric Holder, have recently announced that the U.S. federal government, for the first time since the Harrison Act of 1914, when we began this process, is not going to prosecute at the federal level medical marijuana use. I think that there's a recognition now at the federal level and certainly at the state level that these policies they're not just failed, they're not just counterproductive, they're so immensely costly, both in financial terms and in human lives, that we've got to start rethinking these policies and moving in a different direction. I do think the fiscal crisis is very much part of it, but we have literally placed in the United States 2.3 million people in jail. The graphs indicate quite clearly that the United States leads the list. This cannot be sustained, and we are in pretty bad company when you compare us to places like Russia. The United States would not want to be in that company in many other contexts. Why should we be in that company in the rates of incarceration, especially of so many young people and so many minorities in this country?
Bruce Bagley from the University of Miami, good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.